Hey there, my name's Drew Brashler, and I want to help you feel more confident in your production gear no matter where you're starting from. Today we're going to be talking about EQ, and this is part 2 of the intro to EQ, and this is going to be on the Behringer X32 that I'm showing this to you today. So if you haven't already, make sure to check out my first video where I explain what a parametric EQ is, as a lot of people usually have a question on that when they're starting out with EQ. But today we're actually going to play some music into this board, and I'm going to show you some basics of actually how to use this EQ. So the very first thing that you want to do when you're walking up to a soundboard is you want to flatten everything. So if you're on an analog soundboard, you'd want to zero out all of those little EQ knobs so that you can be the person making those decisions on what EQ you should be applying to your instruments. And so this is something pretty common that I see when I step up to a soundboard at a church or a venue where maybe they're a little bit new to EQing. I see something like this, and I can tell you that this is really a bad EQ curve, and so I'm going to reset this. And so how do we do that? Well, the first thing that we do is we go ahead and select a channel, and we can go ahead and press View on the EQ section, and that will pull it up on the screen on the right-hand side. There is this really handy button called Reset All, and I will typically press this. And you will need to confirm. And now that will reset your EQ. The only thing it does not reset is the low cut, which is over here on the left. You will notice that if we press Reset All, it won't change our low cut, no matter where it is, because that is in a different section, technically. So if you want to turn off the low cut, all you would have to do is press the low cut button or zero it all the way down to 20 hertz. And you can see that it's not going to be applying much of a low cut down there. If you are brand new to EQ, there's a couple settings that I want you to set on your X32 to start out with. And we will start out with our low band first. So I'm going to go ahead and select our low band. And using this mode button, I'm going to change this to be a low shelf. So I'm just going to click through until we get to low shelf. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our frequency knob and rotate this until we get to 105 hertz. So there we got 105 hertz in a low shelf. Now, why do I do this? Well, a low shelf is going to be really helpful for adjusting how much sound there is of a channel going to a subwoofer. Now, most of the subwoofers that are in existence today have a crossover, which means they start working around 100 hertz. They can go as low as 80, maybe 60 hertz, and as high as 125, maybe 150 hertz. But as a general rule of thumb, I typically will set a low shelf about 100 hertz. So this will allow us to either boost low end or cut low end depending on what we need to do with that channel. The next thing I'm going to do is go to my low mid, and I'm going to set this to 250 or around 250. We won't be able to get it perfectly at 250. The closest we can get is 248.9, but that's just fine. And so I will leave it on the PEQ or VEQ. The difference between PEQ and VEQ I spoke about in the previous video in much more detail, but PEQ will allow us to get a more narrow cut, and VEQ will allow us to get a wider bandwidth of frequencies adjusted. So that's going to be the main difference between a PEQ and VEQ. Otherwise, there's no difference. Next thing, high mid. I'm going to go ahead and select that. And I'm going to place this up at 2.5K. Now, why did I choose 250 hertz and 2.5K? Well, 250 hertz happens to be around 200 and 300 hertz, and that frequency tends to muddy up in a mix. And so if you have a whole bunch of channels and all of them are producing that content, and not all of them need to, your mix will start sounding muddy or just hard to hear certain things. And so that's why I select 250 hertz, is that's a happy medium between all of those frequencies that get in that muddy range. Now, 2.5 kilohertz or 2.5K is the spot where it gets very bright and aggressive. So this is a good starting point if you want to cut out a little bit of brightness or hurtful energy of your mix. So sometimes I will bring this up as 4K, but in this 4K to 2.5K is going to be a really good spot to start with this to be if you're wanting to subtract some of that brightness. Additionally, if you're wanting to add some brightness, you can use this same band to boost, and then you can get a little bit of brightness back in. The very last thing is going to be my high band, and I want to set this to a high shelf, which by default, if you reset the EQ on the X32, it will automatically go to a high shelf. But if this was, say, on a PEQ, all we would have to do is press this mode button until we get to the high shelf here. Now, I usually will place this about 6K, and this is going to be a good spot for reducing brightness again, or adding in a little bit of airiness if we had that we wanted to add in on a vocal. So these are going to be my standard spots that I usually leave my EQs, and I will start with them there. So again, rolling through them. Low at about 105 hertz with a low shelf. Low mid between 200 and 300 hertz. High mid between 2 and 4 kilohertz. And then high about 6 to 7K. Now that I have those there, I'm going to talk about two different ways of doing EQ. There's what we call subtractive EQ, and there's what we call positive EQ. Subtractive EQ is a mindset of only subtracting EQ on your channel, and there's some benefits to it and also some cons to it. The other way is positive EQ, where we are boosting EQ. And there are some cons and also some positives to it. And then there's just a mix of the two of them. But first off, I want to talk about subtractive EQ. And I'm going to do this on the bass guitar. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up our bass guitar and play some audio into here. So I'm going to grab my high frequency, and I'm going to actually just bring this all the way down to use this as a good example. Now, if I was wanting to make this guitar, this bass guitar, sound more bassy, if I was using subtractive EQ, I would subtract the high end out of this channel. Likewise, if I was to do positive EQ, I would basically flatten this out, and I would take my low end, and I would boost it. Now, you will notice that the actual tone of the bass guitar doesn't change. It is the same if we use a boost in the low end or a cut in the high end. Now, what's the difference between the two of them? Well, you will notice that the only difference between those two is when we boosted, it got louder, and when we cut, it got quieter. That's the main difference, is if you have 32 channels all having EQ boosted, chances are you will start getting into your clipping light and distorting the left-right bus on the output of your console. And that's why a lot of people will suggest using subtractive EQ, is you can always add gain later on down the road on your board, but it's harder to reduce gain later on down the road on the board. And that means that if I'm having all of these channels boosted here on my volume, and I have all of them with boosted EQs, then that is going to get into that clipping range of the console. If we use subtractive EQ, I can always add volume and get a louder signal at the end, but what it's going to do is not get into that clipping area. And so if we end up taking this and I boost, my low end, and I take out maybe a little bit of lows that are getting muddy, and I add in a whole bunch of 1K here, and so this is an awful EQ. I wouldn't be doing this, but we can see that if I unmute this is going to be louder, and if we add in the rest of our channels, we can easily get into a spot where we get too high of volume into our left-right bus. So that's the main difference between a subtractive EQ and a positive EQ, is subtracting the EQ away from this channel will make it quieter, which we can then turn it up louder on the channel fader. And then positive EQ will risk us kind of getting into that clipping range. But subtractive EQ is a little bit harder to imagine for a new person just getting into EQ, and positive EQ is a whole lot easier to imagine for a person just getting into EQ, as it's easier to boost a frequency than it is to figure out what frequencies I need to cut. So if you are starting out with EQ and you're like, okay, I'm just gonna boost here. So something that I like to do is called the search and destroy method. That's what I call it, at least. It's where you take your bass guitar or whatever channel you have and you take a frequency and you boost it all the way and you sweep this around until you find the frequency that you either want to cut out all the way or boost. And so this is a great way of hearing the EQ for a first beginner with EQ. So, okay, so that's a great spot in that bass guitar that I wanted to boost. And so we have this Q knob and we can change the bandwidth and either make it wider or narrower. And so if we're wanting to change the tonality of an instrument, we want to be making wide bandwidth adjustments. If we're wanting to cut something out surgically, then we want to be using a narrow Q or a higher Q number. And that higher Q number is just going to collapse that EQ down, just be adjusting one little frequency. But if we're wanting to make tonality changes, which is kind of what we're wanting to do with this bass guitar, then we would want to be doing a wider bandwidth adjustment. And so I can see that I'm wanting to boost this kind of 100 to 200 range to get a little bit more low end of this bass guitar. So if I was to do this and I was to see, oh, cool, okay. If I'm wanting to take this and make this a subtractive EQ, I will see that I need to be cutting a shelf around 200 hertz and maybe cutting off a little bit of the low end, but I actually want to keep that in there. So I'm just wanting to make this a darker sounding bass guitar. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look and see where this is. So I'm actually boosting about 10 dB here. And the rest of this is kind of coming in at 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go grab my high band, and I'm going to take this all the way down to 200, and I'm going to subtract this out about to the -10 area, and then I'm going to move this over, and this is about the same sound as what it was before when I was boosting. But the benefit of this is I'm cutting, and so now I'm not getting into that risk of clipping this channel. So if you are starting out with EQ, you can go ahead and see what it looks like with the boosted EQ, and then try and figure out where you need to subtract out of that channel to get the subtractive EQ, as that's going to be better for you in the long run for getting into your mix bus not over-compressing. Now, you probably are wondering, what do I like to do? I like to make a combination of the two. Sometimes I will subtract, sometimes I will boost, just depending on the instrument that I'm picking and the mood that I'm feeling in. So the next thing that I want to show you is the snare drum. And the snare drum that I have here is, it's pretty basic sounding. It's not as low as I'd love for a snare drum to sound, but there's a little bit of stuff happening in the snare drum that I want to get rid of. And this is going to be a perfect example of how to EQ something that you want to make the sound different. So let's go ahead and just listen to this for a sec. Now, the first thing that I can hear in this is I can actually hear the kick drum through this microphone. And I'm going to put Smart up, and Smart is just a spectrum analysis software for audio. It's basically for tuning PAs, but I like to use it live with this view so I can actually see what's happening on this channel. And so we can notice that down in this 63 hertz range, we can see that the kick drum is actually happening, but the actual tonality of that snare drum doesn't start until 125 hertz. So let's give that a listen. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the low cut, and I'm going to bring that up about 115 hertz so I can get rid of the sound of that kick drum, but not change the overall body of the snare drum. So I'm going to go ahead and select my channel, and I'm going to turn on low cut, and I'm going to start bringing this up. So we can notice right away, especially on Smart, that that low cut takes away the kick drum, but then leaves the actual body of that snare still sounding good. We didn't actually change the overall tone of the snare drum. We just cut out that low end that doesn't need to be there. Now the low cut is going to be something that's very helpful for me with the snare drum in getting that kick drum sound out of the snare drum microphone. And by doing that, I'm actually going to clean up my overall mix of everything. Now you can also use the low cut on really any instrument that's on your soundboard. Vocals, acoustic guitar, guitars, keyboards, depending on tracks. All of these instruments can produce some subwoofer information, but that subwoofer information might not be the thing that you want to actually have coming through your subwoofers. The things that I want coming through my subwoofers would be kick drum, bass guitar, some of the tracks, maybe low-end piano, all of that type of stuff is what I want to hear from the subwoofers. But if I have a vocal microphone, I don't want to hear those P's coming through the subwoofer. I just want to hear a clean vocal. Most vocalists aren't going to be producing subwoofer information, so use your low cut. And by doing this, it's just going to remove the low-end information off that channel, like we saw with this kick drum coming through on the snare drum microphone. Now, let's go ahead and continue to EQ this microphone on this snare drum. Okay, so when I'm listening to this, I can hear a little bit of a ring on this snare drum. Now, unfortunately, this was done a long time ago, and so I'm not able to go to the drummer and say, hey, can you get rid of that ring? Maybe either using a moon gel or having the drummer change the tuning of that drum head. That's going to be the first thing that I would do instead of just reaching for an EQ. I would go talk to that musician and say, hey, are you liking the sound of your snare drum right now? And chances are, if there's this huge ring to it, they probably don't like the sound of that. So work with your drummer to get the snare drum sounding correct at the source and then reach for EQ. But in this case, I'm going to use some EQ surgically to remove some of this overtone. Okay, so there's actually two tones that I'm hearing, and I'm going to grab my high mid, and I'm going to go to a very narrow Q, and I'm going to boost up a lot, and I'm going to show you where I'm listening to this ring. That. So I'm going to take that out. The other one that I'm hearing is down here. So I'm going to go ahead and boost this. I'm going to go to a narrow Q, and I'm going to go find it. That. So here's with EQ off. On. Now, there's another part on the snare drum that I'm wanting to show you here, and it's in the 400 range. So I'm going to go ahead and take my high band and go find it here. It's right here. This is usually a spot on a snare drum that I don't like. And typically on any toms, I'm going to be cutting this 400 hertz range because it just sounds boxy. And so I'm going to go ahead and take this out a little bit. Okay, so here's no EQ. And here's with EQ. Very lastly, I'm going to go grab my low band, and I'm going to boost a little bit of my low end here. So I'm going to go to a low shelf, and I'm going to bring it right here and boost this. Restart our tracks here. And so by boosting this body, we are boosting that initial fundamental frequency of the snare drum. And that's going to be that really big tone that we want to have coming through if we're wanting a deeper sounding snare. So you could go as much as this, but that's too much. All right, so here's with no EQ. Okay, so the next thing that I want to show you is how to EQ a vocal. Now, vocals are going to be different depending on the musician that you have singing, female versus male. But the fundamentals that I'm going to show you here are going to be the same. So I'm going to grab my vocalist, and I'm going to go ahead and turn him up.
Stranded by my failure, empty bunch
I do
of
have
love
some
right
compression
after
happening and a little bit of gate that
Gave
happens
me
when
what
he
I
is not
needed,
singing. It takes it away.
broken, now
But let's go ahead and
completed.
give this a
I
listen.
do not deserve your love for me. Even in my failure, you will never fail. Come on!
So the first thing I want to show you on this is I'm going to use the high cut and show you what information that low cut can actually take care of as far as this instrument goes, or this vocalist. So I'm going to take the high cut and I'm going to take it all the way down and show you just the low end information that's coming from this vocal.
You're more than all I want, more than all I need.
All of that information that you're hearing right there is not helpful to the vocal at all. I do realize I'm getting a little bit of the 200 here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this low cut and I'm going to get rid of everything under the 100 to 105 range so that we're not hearing any of that kick drum coming through.
More than all I want, more than all I need, more than anything, you're so good. I can see your light chasing out to me. Yeah.
So you can notice that it doesn't actually change the overall tone of this vocal by bringing in this low cut. I'm just removing all the low end information that doesn't actually have anything to do with this vocalist.
Oh, you are good to me. I can hear your voice calling.
So the next thing that I notice is that this does sound a little bit on the low side. There's a little bit of muddiness to his vocal that I'm going to take care of. Now remember how I asked you to set your low band to a low shelf, and this is going to be a perfect use of this, is I'll actually take this low frequency up to about the 400 range, and I will reduce all of the low end kind of going flat across. So let's go ahead and give this a listen.
I struggle through the garden, following a serpent,
So,
tempted, but your love
all of
ran
this
after me. You
is
gave
not
me
really
what I
helpful to the
needed,
overall vocal
stole
in the
away my
mix.
secrets.
It's just gonna
How
muddy up
could
when I
I
have all the
deserve
vocalists
your
singing. So I'm gonna
love
go
for
ahead and
me?
take that out. I'm gonna subtract
Even
that.
in my weakness, you are always there. Come on. I can see your light chasing out to me.
Now, additionally, one
Sing,
more
you
thing
are
that I'll
good.
end up doing is
You
this
are good
frequencies
to
right
me.
here
I can hear your
can get
voice
really
calling
aggressive
out
on
for
a Beta
me.
58
You are
or an
good.
SM58 or any dynamic
are
microphone that
good
someone
to
has
me.
as they're
Yeah.
getting really close in or
Put your
farther
hands
out with
together.
that
Come on.
proximity effect.
Yeah.
This frequency right here tends to be a little bit aggressive. And so I will go and take my low mid and I'll do a little bit wide of a cut and I will take this out.
Empty bunch of love ran after me. You gave me what I
Now the other
needed,
thing that I'm noticing
broken,
on
now
this vocal is there's a little bit of a nasally
completed.
sound.
I
I'm
do
gonna
not deserve
go ahead and
your
boost and
love
find that for
me.
you.
Even in my failure, you will never fail. Come on. I can see your light chasing out to me.
So I'm gonna find that and take that out.
You are good. You are good to me. I can hear your voice calling out for me. Oh, you are good to me.
Perfect. So this is basically how I go and find the vocal tuning for my EQ is I'll bring up the vocalist and I will find where that low end isn't going to be helpful, and I'll go ahead and cut that out. And then I'll do a low shelf on the bottom portion of this vocal from 400 down. I'll usually do some sort of mid-range cut. And then the very last thing that I use my high band for is if there's a piece of feedback, I'll actually leave my high band available to myself to take care of that piece of feedback. And so what I do is I take this high band and I change it to PEQ, and then I'll leave this down in around the 6 to 8K range. And chances are, at some point in your show, you will have the point where you're boosting your vocal up a lot, and then a frequency will feed back. And so I leave one band always on every vocal available to me to be able to take that out. And so once that piece of feedback happens, I'll take a cue and I'll go ahead and narrow it all the way down. I'll go ahead and find that frequency that's feeding back, and I'll go ahead and cut that out by about 6 to 9 dB. And that will go ahead and take care of that one piece of feedback. Now, depending on where your vocalist is singing on the stage, sometimes that piece of feedback will change in frequency, but we'll be able to use this top band for taking that out. Now, I know I wasn't able to get all of the instruments in today, and this was just a start of EQ, but I hope that this was helpful for you to just learn a little bit of fundamentals of EQ and how it can apply to your soundboard at your venue or church. Now, if you do have any questions, please post them below, as I'm always reading through the comments to find the topic of my next video that's going to be helpful for you. So, thank you so much for watching today.